A black man was wrongfully imprisoned for years. His son, a lawyer, uncovered the shocking truth. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? The morning in Dukeston started like every other, with the heavy southern heat, the smell of gasoline, and the faint hum of radios blaring from shops, garages, and diners. Dust hung in the air, like part of the town's architecture. Down Main Street, amid the half-collapsed buildings from the Great Depression, a truck rumbled by. An old Dodge with sagging suspension, its engine coughing and sputtering as if it resented being alive. The county emblem was plastered on the door. Behind the wheel was the deputy sheriff, and in the back of the truck were bags of cement and boxes of paperwork. Elijah Garrison, a 35-year-old mechanic, stood at the entrance of his garage, wiping his hands on a rag long past its original color. His sun-worn face held a look of quiet focus. He was a tall, lean man with broad shoulders, short-cropped hair, and a touch of gray at his temples. Far too young for that. He had a calmness about him, not from carelessness, but from a practiced ability to keep his cool when things weren't right. A thin scar ran along his left cheek, a remnant from a knife fight back in his youth, when he tried to protect his younger brother during a drunken brawl. His brother had ended up in jail, and Elijah had gone home because he was the only one who kept his mouth shut. He'd always kept that ability. The truck stopped at the gate. The deputy didn't get out. He just honked the horn, and Elijah knew exactly why he'd been called. Trouble with the transmission again. Elijah nodded and walked over without a word, popped the hood, and took a look. In Dukeston, mechanics didn't get asked questions, not if they were black. They got paid just enough to stay alive and were expected to keep their mouths shut. Elijah understood that. His garage sat on the edge of the black neighborhood, just where it met the industrial zone. Land that white folks didn't linger on longer than they had to. "Oil's leaking," muttered the deputy. "Check the gasket." "Mm-hmm," Elijah replied quietly, not even looking up. Half an hour later, the engine was half disassembled. Elijah worked quickly, efficiently. He loved his job, despite the mess it brought with it. Metal was honest. If it broke, there was a reason, and it could always be found. People, though, weren't so straightforward. While he worked on the gasket, a police car drove by. Elijah glanced up for a second and caught a glimpse of the sheriff's face through the window. Sheriff Walter Bryce. Tall, white, in a perfectly pressed uniform, with gray at his temples and a cold look in his eyes. He didn't stop, just slowed down as if making sure Elijah was still there. Their eyes met. The sheriff didn't nod or smile, just kept going. A couple of hours later, a warning signal blared on all the county radio stations. A woman's voice, trembling slightly, announced, "Missing girl. Melissa Bryce, 19 years old. Last seen on the outskirts of Dukeston around 9 p.m. last night. Her car was found near the old grain mill outside of town. Please call the police department with any information." The mention of the Bryce name changed the atmosphere in town. Melissa was the sheriff's niece. People knew her as a quiet, somewhat distant girl who went to college in Montgomery but came home for the holidays. No one ever said anything bad about her, but she didn't have close friends either, just a good girl from a good family. That evening, 2 cops showed up at the garage. No warrant. One carried a folder, the other a radio. They walked right in without knocking. "Elijah Garrison?" the older one asked. "We need to take a look at your car." "What's this about?" Elijah's voice was calm, but his chest tightened. "We found tire tracks near the mill. Matches yours. Hand over the keys." He passed them over. Arguing was pointless. They searched the car. 5 minutes later, they found a knife. An old pocket knife with bloodstains. One of the cops nodded to the other. Everything moved fast. The second cop pulled out handcuffs. "This isn't my knife," Elijah said, looking at them like they were people he used to know but didn't anymore. "I had one like that 10 years ago. Lost it." "Guess it just turned up," one of them sneered. "Convenient, huh?" Elijah didn't resist. He knew how this would end. The town wasn't looking for the truth. The town wanted order and a scapegoat. As they led him down Main Street, no one turned away. Instead, they all watched, some in silence, some with judgment, some with a quiet, "What did you expect?" in their eyes. Everyone knew who he was, the black mechanic who worked on white folks' cars and always kept to himself. And now he was the one with the knife near the body. The next morning, the papers had a brief headline: Elijah Garrison, 35, black, arrested on suspicion of murdering Melissa Bryce. Investigation ongoing. No mention that there was almost no evidence. No mention that the mill where the car was found was right next to Elijah's garage, one of the few abandoned places left in the county. No mention that Elijah had no criminal record. Just a photo, a grainy black and white shot, and eyes that weren't filled with fear, only exhaustion. At the station, they interrogated him without a lawyer. The reports were full of mistakes. Words were twisted. He said he hadn't seen Melissa, that he'd been working that night, that he had a notebook with his orders. They didn't listen. His story didn't fit the one they were already writing in their offices. Sheriff Bryce came to his cell that evening. He stood there, hands behind his back. "You were a good mechanic, Garrison," he said, looking through the bars. "But you forgot where you live." Elijah stared back at him, unwavering. "I didn't go anywhere," he replied quietly. "It's you who never came by." The sheriff didn't respond. He turned and walked away. From that moment, Elijah knew. He no longer had a name, only a number, and a lie that had become evidence. Dukeston wasn't much of a city. It was more like a stretched-out community along two highways where everyone knew each other by name. On Sunday mornings, the streets emptied out as people went to one of the three different churches, divided not just by denomination, but by skin color too. In places like that, rumors didn't spread. They seeped in, crawled into the cracks of walls, and got caught in the air. So when Melissa Bryce, the sheriff's niece, went missing, and a black mechanic was found near where her abandoned car was found, alone that night with a bloody knife, this wasn't about solving a crime. It was about keeping the peace. The trial started almost immediately. No delays, no unnecessary fuss. It was as if the town wanted to put this chapter behind them as quickly as possible. Inside the county courthouse, where the ceiling fans fought a losing battle against the June heat, most of the room was filled with white folks: jurors, local reporters, businessmen in suits, a couple of women from the church choir. The Garrison family wasn't there. Mary knew no one would listen, especially with a knife already on the table, and Sheriff Bryce silently watching the defendant's back. Elijah sat straight, his hands resting on his lap. He didn't struggle, didn't argue, didn't yell. He just stared ahead, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening to him. His lips pressed together, and only when someone in the gallery whispered "animal" did his jaw tighten. But he said nothing. The court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Halverson, looked tired. He wasn't mean or indifferent. He'd just seen too many cases where a black man was accused of something he supposedly did, and too few where anyone tried to prove otherwise. He spoke in a flat tone, almost monotone, and didn't argue with the judge when he rejected a motion for a second round of forensic testing. "Fingerprints?" the judge asked again. "Lost. It happens." "Neighbors?" They were too scared to speak up. One man from Elijah's block testified that he might have seen him at home, but he didn't show up to the trial. They said he'd gone to visit his mother-in-law in the next county. "Until this all blows over." Sheriff Bryce spoke as if he was just doing his duty. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make accusations. He spoke calmly, almost regretfully. "We found the knife in his car. The blood matches the girl's group. Her car was near the mill where he worked. Too many coincidences for it to be random." And that was it. No tears, no outbursts, just dry words, documents, and faces that read like one thought: "Let's wrap this up as fast as we can." The jury didn't deliberate long, less than an hour. The verdict had been decided long before the trial even began. Guilty, the judge pronounced, and there wasn't a sound in the room. Elijah didn't look at the gallery, his gaze fixed on one spot on the wall, where the plaster had peeled away next to a portrait of Lyndon Johnson. His fingers trembled, but he still didn't say a word. Next to him sat a guard, a white man with a neck tattoo, partially hidden under his shirt collar. He didn't look at Elijah, just tipped his hat back and stood when the judge ordered him to escort the defendant. There were no goodbyes. Elijah's son wasn't allowed in the courtroom. Mary kept him home, telling him that Dad's off fixing cars somewhere far away for a long time. But Marcus saw his mother crying and knew the truth. Mary left Dukeston 3 days after the verdict. She sold the sewing machine, left the house keys with a neighbor who didn't even come out to say goodbye. She didn't believe in justice anymore. She knew no one in this town would offer a hand to a woman whose husband was now considered the killer of a white girl. She took Marcus and left for Birmingham, where no one knew the Garrison name. Elijah was sent to prison right away. No waiting, no pause. The cell, the chains, the dusty-colored uniform. On the ride over, no one spoke to him. The guard sitting opposite him read the newspaper, chewing gum, like it was just another day. The car sped down the highway, past fields where people picked corn under the blazing sun. Through the window, America flashed by, a version of it that would never know who Elijah Garrison truly was. Back in town, people breathed a sigh of relief. In the barber shop, someone said, "Well, at least now it's clear." At the corner store, the cashier whispered, "Glad he didn't run." The paper ran a headline, "Local mechanic convicted of murdering sheriff's niece." No mention of the girl's name, no words of sympathy, just a photo of Elijah in handcuffs, black and white, low quality. He looked straight into the lens like he was looking right through it. And no one asked. Why did the knife show up 3 days later? Why wasn't there blood on his clothes? Why hadn't the witnesses been properly questioned? Because no one wanted to ask those questions. Because in 1975, in Dukeston, Alabama, the truth didn't carry any weight when it was wrapped in black skin. The son grew up with someone else's last name. The mother worked 3 jobs. The father sat in a cell where even the sunlight couldn't get through the bars. Justice was buried along with Melissa Bryce's body, and no one had any intention of digging it up. And only Elijah, quiet, stubborn, with no faith but with dignity, sat and waited. Not for vengeance, not for forgiveness, but for the day when at least one person would dare to say, "What if he's not guilty?" Elijah Garrison arrived at Montgomery County Jail in July of 1975. The air was thick, soaked in sweat, heat, and decay. The building, a concrete rectangle with no shade surrounded by barbed wire, smelled of old paint, rust, and the fear of those inside. This wasn't just a prison for bodies, but for voices too. No one spoke more than they had to, and every sound felt like a threat. He walked in not as a criminal, but as a man already condemned. Without a word, they stripped him down, shaved his head, put him in a gray jumpsuit, handed him a metal bowl, and a mattress as thin as newspaper. The cell, a solitary one, had concrete walls marked with the imprints of fists. A low window near the ceiling with a rusted grate that offered no view of the sky or any hope. The guard, a white man with a round face and eyes that had long lost any trace of compassion, didn't even look him in the eye. He just threw out, "Here, you're nobody." On the first day, no one spoke to him. On the first month, no one answered him. The cellmates, mostly white prisoners, many locked up for violence, theft, and often murder, didn't accept him. Not because he was the new guy, but because he was black. Because the papers said he killed a white girl. Because prison wasn't just a place without laws. It had its own code. And according to that code, he was an enemy. They spit in his bowl, put soap in his food, broke his things, shoved him as they passed by. The most aggressive was Johnny Ray, a former member of a neo-Nazi gang, with a swastika tattooed on his chest. He was broad-shouldered, wore his hair short, and spoke with a heavy southern drawl. One day in the mess hall, he sneered, "You're breathing my air, you filthy liar." The guards didn't intervene. One of them, a Vietnam vet named Dexter, would even smile watching the fights. He had a scar on his neck and a chewing tobacco box in his pocket. He liked watching the prisoners fight, especially when the black ones lost. Elijah knew if he fought back, they'd just label him as aggressive and throw him in solitary. But if he broke, they'd win anyway. So he stayed silent. He ate what was left. He slept with one eye open. He fixed his sandals when they tore. And he watched. He noticed how one of the guards never fully closed the door to the block. The hinges squeaked. How the kitchen cart broke down often, making them wait longer for meals. He noticed how his cellmate, a young guy named Ramirez, would stare at a letter, not knowing which side to read. A few weeks later, he approached a guard near the workshop, Mr. Lawrence, an old and tired man who didn't share the hatred of his colleagues and just wanted to make it to retirement. "I can take a look at your boiler. It's leaking, and soon it's going to catch fire," Elijah said. Without a word, Lawrence led him inside. In an hour, Elijah fixed not only the boiler, but the coffee machine that had been broken for 2 years. Lawrence said, "You've got skills." "Mechanic?" Elijah just nodded and went back to his cell. The next day, he was called back. Then again, he started coming to the workshop, patching pipes, fixing chairs, even restoring an old radio. The other inmates watched at first, then started asking, "Can you fix the fan?" "Check my watch, it's not working." He helped, no words, no strings attached. Letters were the next thing he worked on. Ramirez, holding a letter nervously, whispered, "My mom wrote, but I don't know how." Elijah took the letter, read it, and wrote a reply. Neat handwriting, simple English, no mistakes. That's how his corner began, in the library where he started helping others. The ones who couldn't read, he taught them, slowly, patiently. First the letters, then the words, then the sentences. He didn't talk about himself. He just asked, "Do you know how to spell home?" 3 months later, Johnny Ray came to the library, silent, hands in his pockets. He spoke quietly. "Teach me, but don't tell anyone." He had a son he'd never seen. The letter came from his ex-wife. Johnny couldn't read. He didn't want anyone to know. Elijah didn't ask why. He just started A, B, C, memorized them. Months passed. In the winter of 1976, when the heating in the wing broke down temporarily, Elijah suggested wrapping the pipes so they wouldn't burst. They started calling him the Master. Johnny Ray began carrying around a notebook. He no longer mocked him. One day he told a guard, "Garrison's not like the rest. He's smart, and he didn't touch that girl. I know guys like him. He's not like that." Other inmates started to notice, first quietly to each other, then openly. Someone asked, "Hey, Garrison, you really didn't do it." Elijah replied, "I didn't do it, but no one believed me." Someone else said, "Now we believe." It wasn't a turning point. It was a shift. Slow, like water wearing down stone. He didn't become a hero. He didn't become a friend. But he became a person. Not an object of hate, but a being with a name. And when new inmates whispered, "That's the one, the killer of the white girl," others responded, "Don't rush. It's not that simple." Guard Lawrence started bringing him old newspapers. One day he said, "You read more than my grandson. Maybe they shouldn't have locked you up." In the library under the lamp, in the silence, surrounded by shelves that smelled of dust and time, Elijah Garrison sat and wrote. Not about pain, not about prison, but about how to survive, how to keep your dignity, how to stay yourself when everyone around you wants you to disappear. He didn't know who would read his words, or when. He didn't know if his son was alive. He only knew that in those concrete walls where silence drowned the truth, words were the only thing that could set you free. And one day, years later, one of the guards whispered, passing by the cell, "If anyone didn't do it, it was you." Marcus Garrison didn't carry his father's last name. Actually, he didn't even acknowledge it. After Mary took him from Dukestown to Birmingham, the boy grew up, as the neighbors put it, on the edge of two worlds. On one side, the impoverished black neighborhoods, where his mother sewed at night just to make rent and feed them. On the other, a partial scholarship at a Christian school, where he was mocked for his skin color and his quiet nature. When asked about his father, he either walked away or said he'd died. Even as he grew older, even when he started going to the library, reading about civil rights and Martin Luther King's speeches, he still believed that the father he'd never met could have been a killer. The letters came out of nowhere. At first he thought about burning them. They were in a cardboard box under an old blanket in a closet, pulled out after his mother passed away from liver cancer. She'd kept her diagnosis hidden until it was too late. Before she died, she said, "You need to know who he is, not who they made him out to be." Then, silence. And then, the box. Inside were dozens of letters, written in a neat hand, with corrections, nearly flawless. In each one, there were no apologies, no pleas, just reflections on how quickly justice could be broken, on the people he met in prison, on the Bible he'd started reading, not for salvation, but to keep from losing his mind. He wrote about his mistakes, but never his guilt. There was no anger, just exhaustion and something that resembled acceptance. And at the bottom of each letter, always, with love, your father, Elijah. Marcus said the name out loud for the first time, and for the first time, he didn't say it with hate. By then, he was a law school graduate. He'd interned in Atlanta, then Montgomery. He knew how to blend in, well-dressed, smiling, but reserved. He hated conflict. He was a good listener, and that's what earned him a position as a temporary assistant district attorney in Clay County, which included Dukestown. He changed his last name to his mother's, Hill. No one ever questioned it. He didn't hide the truth. He just didn't talk about it. The courthouse in Dukestown was old, brick with streaks of rust beneath the windows. The secretary, a frail white woman with a forced smile. In the DA's office, it smelled of cigarettes and old paper. On the walls, photos of previous district attorneys, all white, all in the same suits. In the archive, in the basement, it smelled of dust and mice. Marcus asked for access under the pretense of studying 1970s case law for a term paper. No one objected. Who, in 1975, cared about cases from 1975? He found case number 1975-1186-B. The charge, Elijah Garrison, first-degree murder. The case file was thin, no more than a dozen pages. Witness statements, the coroner's report, crime scene photos. The cover sheet was dated April 3, 1975. But one detail stood out to him, the evidence log for a pocket knife dated April 6th. The girl had died the night of April 2nd. Where had the knife been for 3 days? Why were there no fingerprints? How was it so easily linked to Elijah? He started digging. First, he compared the dates. Then he found newspaper clippings. Melissa Bryce, sheriff's niece, a local college student, died from a knife wound. In the photo, she was a slim, blonde girl in a dance costume from her school yearbook. The caption read, "Beloved niece of Sheriff Bryce, the light of Dukestown." He remembered hearing as a child someone on the street say, "It was that black guy who fixed trucks." Back then, he didn't understand who they meant. Now everything was coming together. He searched for witnesses. Most of them had moved out of town or passed away. There was only one left, the librarian, Susanna Hale, who still worked at the city library. She recognized him when he introduced himself. "You're Elijah's son," she said quietly. He nodded. She led him to a back room, pulled a folder from a drawer. Inside were letters, copies of the ones Elijah had written from prison. "He asked me to keep them. He said, if anyone ever wants to know the truth, let them start with these words." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat in a cheap motel room by the highway, listening to trucks rumble past the window, and reread the letters. He thought about how a man could be so resilient, even after losing everything. He remembered his mother, how she ironed his shirts before exams, how she'd stare out the window when she came home from her evening shifts. She never spoke ill of his father, only once, when he asked why she never left. She answered, "Because he stayed here, and I didn't want you to grow up without roots." The next day, Marcus went back to the archive. He was looking for medical records. He found the patient log for the city clinic from April 1975. Among the entries was a name, Roy Bryce. Time of visit, the night of April 2nd to 3rd. Reason, cut on his palm, listed as drunk, agitated, signed J.E. Harper, EMT. He wrote down the details. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure, but the seed had been planted. He could feel something new growing inside him. Not anger, not hatred, but the need to know the truth. Even if he didn't like it, even if it changed everything. He wasn't a lawyer yet, but for the first time, he became a son. Truly. Marcus Garrison woke up early, though sleep still clung to his limbs. Outside, the southern sun was already burning through the streets of Dukestown, casting its heat over the cracked pavement, mixing with the dust and silence. The city seemed to know. Someone was digging into its rotten roots again. He threw on a shirt, tucked it into his pants, checked his reflection, carefully composed, part of the armor he wore every day to hide his last name, his heritage, and his anger. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew he was taking on a system where everything, hospital, courthouse, the whole damn town, was tied up in the same hands. But the records from the archives, copies of medical charts, reports, shift notes, they didn't lie. On the night Melissa Bryce was murdered, a young white man had been brought into the emergency room with a sliced-up hand. His name, Bryce. First name, Roy. Age, 19. Injury, a deep cut on his left palm. Reason, not listed. The entry was brief, but it had the signature of the nurse, and the date was the same. It didn't take him long to find out who Roy Bryce was. It took time, calls, and cold patience. Edward McLean, the ER nurse from 1975, now lived in a small house on the Mississippi border. Retired, spending his days alone with a sour face and hands that shook from age. "I don't want to get involved in politics," he said when Marcus showed him the photocopies of the old records. "But I remember that guy. Came in with his hand wrapped up. Drunk, kept whining about a Melissa. I didn't know who she was back then. Then the next day, they called us into the sheriff's office. Told us to forget the visit, and we forgot." Marcus stared at him for a long time. Then quietly he said, "He killed her, and my father went down for it." The words hung in the air like a weight the old man couldn't carry anymore. On his way back to Dukestown, Marcus felt the city closing in, its walls drawing tighter. Every street here knew how to keep quiet. It was a habit, as old as the white picket fence on the Bryce house. He parked in front of the county courthouse, clutching the documents, copies of old records, witness statements, a letter from McLean, signed in shaky, trembling handwriting. He didn't know if it would be enough, but he knew. It was the first real chance he'd had. He filed a motion to reopen Elijah Garrison's case based on new evidence. He pointed out the conflict of interest. Sheriff Bryce had overseen the case where his own nephew was the main suspect. He highlighted the lost evidence, the unconfirmed testimonies, the medical chart. He knew he wouldn't break through the wall with truth, but with pressure, and he included a statement from the Garrison family, requesting Elijah's temporary release pending the hearing. The waiting lasted 3 weeks. Every morning he woke with a heavy weight on his chest. Every day he went to the archives, the university library, the town hall. He found a letter written by the girl the day before her death, a draft forgotten in a library book. "Roy, this isn't right. You're scaring me. We can't keep doing this." He showed it to the detective, but the guy just shrugged. "Letters aren't evidence." Then came the call. The hearing was set. Elijah Garrison would be temporarily released until the case could be reviewed. Marcus stood there holding the phone, frozen, staring out of his office window. He didn't know what to say. He just felt something inside, something that had been locked up for years, begin to thaw. They met in the reception room, a small hall by the prison exit. It smelled of tobacco and old paint. Elijah stepped out in the gray clothes they issued for releases. His hair had grayed, his face hardened, but his eyes were clear. They stared at each other, unmoving. Then Elijah spoke softly. "You've grown." Marcus didn't answer. He just nodded. He didn't know what to say. They got into the car, driving in silence. But it didn't matter. There were too many years, too much pain, too many questions between them. They didn't try to pretend. They just drove forward, back into the town that would have to listen again. Meanwhile, Roy Bryce lived on the outskirts of town, in a house bought with money he'd earned from an auto shop that had once belonged to Elijah. He drank heavily, growing more withdrawn with each passing day. No one touched his nephew. The uncle, though aging, still had pull. His word carried more weight in town than any judge's. But when they told him the 1975 murder case was being reopened, he faltered for the first time in years. He called Roy in, locked the doors, shouted at him. But it was too late. Everything was starting to crack. Rumors began to spread. Someone remembered that night. Someone else remembered the knife that was found in Elijah's car 3 days later. The papers didn't pick it up, not yet, but the town could feel it. The evening before the hearing, Marcus sat at the kitchen table in the old house he'd shared with his mother. Elijah stood by the window. The silence between them was thick, almost palpable. "I knew you'd come," Elijah said. Marcus didn't turn around. He just answered, "I'm not here for you. I'm here for the truth." Elijah nodded. Then he said, "And that's the same thing." That night, neither of them slept. The house was nearly empty, just a table, 2 beds, and an old radio. But it was enough. They waited for morning, knowing that tomorrow the town would hear a name it had tried so hard to forget. And that name would ring out loud. Dukestown was sweltering in the summer heat. The air in the small courthouse, tucked away in an old building on the outskirts of town, felt thick, almost suffocating with anticipation. In this room, where the walls had long witnessed tragedy, the people who were meant to hear the truth were finally gathered. Those who would break the chain of lies and bias that had ruined so many lives. Elijah Garrison, a man weathered by years of hardship behind bars, with graying hair and an unshakable calm, was stepping outside those doors for the first time as a free man, even if just temporarily, until the review hearings took place. His face was stern, but in his eyes there was a quiet fire, the fire of a man who'd faced injustice time and again, and was now ready to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that had been shaped by hundreds of grueling hours of labor and confinement. His skin was marked by small scars and calluses, reminders of a life where every single day was a battle. Marcus Garrison, now a man nearing 30, stood beside his father. Dressed in a sharp suit, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that radiated determination, he looked every bit the part of the lawyer he had become. In his journey from the boy who once believed his father's guilt to the young attorney willing to tear down the walls of injustice, Marcus had come a long way. His mission was clear: to restore his father's name and show the town that the truth mattered more than a comfortable lie, even if that truth was bitter. He never forgot how his mother had kept the faith in Elijah until the end, passing on letters and diaries that revealed the inner turmoil of the man wrongly accused, a man caught in the gears of a broken system. The courtroom was filled with a small group of people, mostly older folks, the ones who remembered a time when the color of your skin could determine your fate, and the ones eager for change, even if it meant risking everything. At the center of it all stood the old sheriff, Walter Bryce. His head was now graying, and his face wore the practiced restraint of a man who'd held power for far too long. But his grip on the reins was still ironclad, a symbol of the old order that had dictated life in Dukestown for so many years. In his eyes, Marcus could see a mix of irritation and fear. The irritation of a case that had finally gone public, and the fear of what might happen if his reputation, and the power that came with it, started to slip. Roy Bryce, his nephew, the man who'd once been shielded by his uncle's influence, was now under intense scrutiny. The same Roy whose hand had been cut up that fateful night, his red-rimmed eyes betraying guilt and tension as he struggled to maintain an indifferent facade. The hearings began with the presentation of new evidence uncovered by Marcus. Photos, documents, records from past medical checkups, all of it pieced together into one undeniable picture. Roy's injury lined up perfectly with the night of the girl's murder. A witness, a retired paramedic with a tired gaze, testified that Roy had come to him that night, drunk with blood on his hand, saying, "Melissa and I are done." But the police, under the sheriff's orders, had told him not to log it in the official records. This revelation exposed a clear conflict of interest, revealing the cover-up that had hidden the truth behind the tragedy and Elijah's wrongful conviction. The courtroom was electric, the air thick with the weight of the truth and the looming sense of change. Marcus didn't just speak as a lawyer, he became the voice of a generation weary of prejudice and lies. His words were simple, but powerful. You can't build justice on lies and fear. His arguments he supported by testimonies from former inmates, including Johnny Ray, a man who'd once despised Elijah, but now stood as a witness to his strength and dignity, began to tip the scales of justice. And then there was Susanna Hale, the librarian who had supported Elijah from behind bars and became a symbol of belief in justice. With each new piece of evidence, the tide of public opinion turned. Sheriff Bryce, struggling to keep his composure and his grip on power, countered with measured arguments. But every word he spoke felt like an attempt to stop the inevitable flood of truth. His voice was hoarse, his eyes darting between Marcus and Elijah, every gesture betraying the exhaustion of a man who had lost control. But in the end, under the crushing weight of the evidence, Roy Bryce could no longer keep up the charade. He confessed that, in a fit of rage and desperation, he had struck Melissa that night, the truth coming out in the open like a dam breaking. Elijah, listening to it all, remained calm. There was relief in his eyes, yes, but also a deep weariness, a sense that, finally, things were about to change. He looked at Marcus, the son who had fought through all the trials and tribulations to restore not only his father's name, but the very honor that had been stolen from him. Walking out of the courtroom, Elijah was greeted by the faces of those who had been waiting for his return. Mary, who had never cracked under the weight of her losses, and Marcus, now not just a son, but an ally, a friend. Together they embraced a quiet peace, one that was hard-earned and long-awaited. The Garrison house, old and modest, but filled with warmth and hope, had become a symbol of a new chapter for the family. Inside, there were no grand speeches, just silent acceptance and a promise to start anew. Elijah, Mary, and Marcus sat by the window, the soft daylight filtering through, and they knew, after all the storms, it was time for quiet, time for healing. They understood now that justice wasn't a gift, but the result of a long and hard-fought battle. And that victory, though it came at a steep price, was worth every moment of suffering. This chapter wasn't just the end of a case, it was the beginning of change for all of Dukestown, a town that would remember how one man stood up to the system and altered the course of history. But more than anything, it was the story of family, love, and forgiveness, the kind of healing that can mend even the deepest wounds. It was a time for truth to be heard, for understanding to grow, and finally for forgiveness to heal old wounds.